I sat handcuffed to a wheelchair, crippled to the point where breathing seemed to be the only function I could successfully manage. I was in a courtroom lined with polished wood panels and where all the public gallery seats were empty. Somehow they must have successfully wrangled that the court being open to the public would have frustrated the process of administrating a so-called justice. Obviously, for whatever reason, the powers that be wanted this to be a hush-hush affair rather than a media circus. Even though I was debilitated, they still had a few security officers within the courtroom. However, they appeared to be the penny a dozen private security types. They certainly didn't look the healthiest of sorts, with their pot-bellies clinging on for dear life as they hung over their trouser belts. All of them wheezed and sucked in large breaths, since even the act of standing seemed far too strenuous for them. Of course, even before the charade started, I knew I would vehemently dislike the judge and the prosecutor, but it did come as a shock when I found that I wanted to hurt my own barrister the most. This was, of course, due to the fact that he appeared more keen on getting me locked up than the prosecution themselves, which meant it was a courtroom where it seemed every person was taking relish in what they thought would be the inevitable outcome. Prior to the court hearing, my barrister had briefly met with me to discuss the proceedings. As I was barely able to talk, he simply talked at me and informed me of what was going to happen. This is a strange one, especially as no one has any idea of who you are. Anyhow, I've made it so that you have already pleaded guilty today, so we're just having the sentencing hearing. It'll be a quick and painless process. Well, imagine not so painless for you, but none of us want to waste our time. Of course, what we're doing is somewhat illegal, but you'll be locked away in seclusion before you have the capability to raise any allegations about our conduct. Also, it'll be a cold day in hell before anyone believed you," he said with a cocky smirk. My initial instinct was to try and rip his throat out, but I was a long way away from being capable. Instead, I kept calm and grinned at the barrister. I then gave him a cheeky wink. He was taken aback. "You really are chuffing," tapped him a head. "Certainly makes an awful lot of sense," he scolded. A brief look of embarrassment appeared on his face after accidentally revealing too much of his Yorkshire upbringing. Still the grin on my face, I motioned my hand for him to get closer so he could hear me speak. At first he hesitated and then shrugged. "I'm going to kill you first," I just about whispered. "Yes, you are definitely quite mad. I suppose you have to be to do the things you did. Anyway, I'll see you in the courtroom. Goodbye." Perhaps the barrister was quite right in regard to the sanity part, as I had this feeling of intense mania since the little dog popped in for its visits. Nothing had actually changed since I agreed to the deal, as the little dog disappeared straight after our conversation. I should have seen this as confirmation that my sanity had indeed vacated its home, but for some peculiar reason I felt rather confident that something that worked in my favour was going to happen in court that day. Hence I was wheeled into the courtroom with a supremely wide smile on my face. One of the guards, the most overweight and obese one, kept on looking at me and then grimaced. "Creepy bastard," I heard him mutter. The judge who presided over the case spoke with a most formal and aristocratic accent that spoke volumes about his class and upbringing. Such communications was to demonstrate that he was from the country's most well-bred stock, even though he looked quite the opposite. Big floppy ears, a long fromposed nose, dull grey beady eyes, and a crooked teeth on a wrinkly gaunt face said that he was the runt of a genetic litter. Regardless, he was a man of power, and it certainly sounded like he rather enjoyed it. On entering the court, the judge's beady eyes fell on me, and the disgust and hate were not concealed on his face. I imagine there wasn't a jury nor any members of the public present. He was far more open to reveal his true self. It wasn't until the report of a guilty verdict and the reading of the offences from the prosecution that the judge made his first swipe at me. "I suggest that the defendant wipe that juvenile and hideous smile off his face. Does he not know where he is? Your Honour, I'm afraid the defendant's nerves have got the best of him. Please let me have a quick word with him. My barrister responded. Wipe that smile off your face, you muppet, he whispered in my ear. Oh, what will either of you do? I just about chuckled out. He glared at me and then turned to the judge. Your Honour, I'm afraid the defendant will not stop his silly game. I do not believe that we can ask the guards to forcibly stop him from smiling, so please may we continue? The judge glared at me, clearly trying to bring me into line with the power he wielded. I simply stared back and waited. It wasn't long until the process started again and the offences were discussed by the prosecution. I wasn't paying attention to the long list of charges that I'd been accused of, but I did notice that it took quite a fair few minutes before she was finished. I was busy fantasizing about how I was going to dismantle everyone who had caused me offence. It was only the court usher and clerk who seemed to have any semblance of professionalism. The prosecutor then went on some spiel about me being so heinous that I swear she was on the verge to call me the Antichrist. I did notice that they tried to attribute a murder to me. It was quite rich that they did this, as the guard died in the hospital due to a MRSA infection. The rapidly descending quality of increasingly gutted healthcare system was not my fault at all. I zoned out for the rest of the speech, as it was unnecessarily long-winded. What took 15 minutes could have taken 2. It was clear that the barristers and the judge were people who got masturbatory joy from hearing the sound of their own voices. The prosecution finally came to something marginally more entertaining and read out statements from the victims. To do this, she pulled out a heavy, thick batch of papers from a briefcase. The weight of the statements caused an almighty thud on the desk where they were dropped. This was probably done for dramatic effect and to cause shock. Instead, though, I felt a slight beam of pride. I also thought to myself that I hadn't actually done that much harm to anyone, as most of them had survived the ordeal with injuries that would heal. Clearly, I didn't realize how terribly sensitive some people were. One victim talked about continued psychological trauma, how it was going to be a year until he could walk properly again, constant sleepless nights, and that he had to go on long-term sick from work for intensive therapeutic support for his injured mind and body, that he was suffering from crippling anxiety, and so on and so on and so on. I raised an eyebrow and then chuckled a bit to myself due to the absurdity of what was being read out. It was, as after all, no more than a good beating that he had endured. The next victim's statement reported pretty much the same thing, but they added that this person now struggled with impotency. I chuckled to myself again. At this rate, it would not be long before they blame me for the problems in the Middle East. My defence barrister turned round and glared at me. I stared back at his scowling face until I won the competition and he turned back round. Then the prosecution said that since the hostage situation, this guard had also suffered with urinary and bowel incontinence. When that was read out, it could not be helped. I had a right good laugh. Even though I must have ripped a few stitches with thought of a prison guard on the verge of tears, running to the toilet with his hand over his clenched bottom to make sure I was good as gone. I don't feel any shame in admitting that such slapstick comedy is my cup of tea. There will be no such disgusting and offensive behaviour in my courtroom. Do you hear me? The judge snarled. Still I roared with laughter, but also grimaced in pain after every few chuckles. It was clear that even without the deal with a little dog, whoever was running the show had a plan for me, and they weren't going to deviate from it. My sentence was certainly not going to be reduced with any forms of good behaviour, and it was obvious that the sentencing needed to be completed as soon as possible. So I carried on with abandon until eventually my body told me it could take no more. As soon as I had quietened down, the prosecutor continued reading out the victim's statements, whilst the judge sullenly stared at me. Unfortunately, there's no further material that brought a repeat of such mirth. My defense barrister, in response to what the prosecutor had presented, simply said there was nothing to add. No background information was available, and there were no circumstantial considerations. As no one knew who I was, it didn't take long before the sentencing began. An evil and hideous grin that showed each crooked tooth and its disfigured glory erupted onto the judge's face. I have heard both sides with regard to the defendant. Without doubt, it is clear that this man is a significant danger to society. There's no remorse demonstrated, and it is felt that only his injuries prevent further acts of dangerous and morally repugnant behaviour. The sentencing will be of harshest severity within the current guidelines. Now I can assure the court that due to the number of his offences, the defendant will not see the light of day until the oldest of age or death. I do not... The judge snarled out before being interrupted by laughter. Ha! 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 It wasn't me returning to my merriment. It was that familiar voice which somehow hit every high and low octave. I will only do this once. It's only because it's the start of our arrangement. Anyhow, please do enjoy your revenge on this corrupt theatre. I heard the voice say. Everyone else in the court looked around, trying to find out where this terrible voice came from. What? How dare you suggest corruption? Find this dreg that is making such a racket in my court. I'll make sure they are charged with contempt. The judge shrilled. One of the guards walked round the court and then stopped at the public gallery. Bloody hell, Your Honour, someone's left their dog here, the guard exclaimed. As the circus continued, I felt a peculiar tingling sensation emanating from all of my wounds. It was quite an odd sensory experience, quite pleasurable but also very painful. Then it felt as if each wound became glued shut and within seconds there was no more pain. Out of curiosity I looked down at my shackles which appeared to be melting as they'd been turned into what looked like milk chocolate. A quick shrug of the shoulders showed my acceptance of the impossible, and then I went about eating my delicious new bonds. It had been so long since I had chocolate, and this was clearly at the highest grade. The silkiness and the creaminess were in perfect harmony with the cocoa. I was able to leave the whole of my shackles without anyone paying me any notice, as they were all distracted by the little dog. The fat guards were waddling after the deity, who was easily and casually trotting away from them. When I finished my snack, I stood up, jumped over the dock and landed right next to my defence barrister. He immediately turned around and gave me a look of surprise. My apologies, but this will hurt quite a bit, I said while sneering. My arm shot out, grabbed his throat and lifted him off the ground. That was when everyone else realised that I was free. Gods! Gods! The judge shouted. The defence barrister tried clawing at my wrist and shook his head, tried to convince me to stop. By the time the first guard reached me, there were 4 finger-sized holes in the dead barrister's throat, and blood profusely gushed out. I dropped the body and swung right round to connect the left hook square on the fat guard's chin. It was a perfect strike, and a fair few teeth flew out of his mouth as his body crumbled. I then sprinted across towards the judge and jumped to pull myself up onto his stand. I heard the little dog's spine-tickling chuckle follow. Ho, ho, ho! I dare say your corruption is treasonous, and the sentence for that is, of course, death. I spat. The quivering judge closed his eyes and smelled the urine flood of the air. I grabbed his silly little wig and flung it away. In one quick action, I smashed his bold, freckled, sunspot-covered head sideways down onto his desk. Next, I grabbed his pen and stabbed it right through the temple till it hit the other side of his skull. Ha ha! Marvellous, old chap! Absolutely bloody marvellous! I heard the little dog cheer. I looked around. None of the guards were approaching me. They were all huddled with everyone else trying to open the courtroom door to get away. However, for some reason it was locked, and they were all trapped inside with me. I sauntered across towards the 4 guards that remained, the court usher, the clerk, the solicitors, and the prosecuting barrister. One of the guards thought he would try his luck and ran up to me, but in the process tripped over his feet and cracked his head on the corner of a public gallery. The blood leaked all over the courtroom floor. When I reached the prosecutor, she thought that perhaps her ability to persuade might save her.
Listen here, if you stop now, we can make a plea bargain. We can get you the best deal possible. I'll make sure of it,
she pleaded, just before I wrung her neck like a chicken. The prosecutor crumpled to the floor. I looked at the rest of the quivering court. There was an incentive to dispose of them, and it felt wrong to hurt those who wouldn't fight back. No, perfectly understand, young chap. They're a bit pathetic, aren't they? Also, I imagine you're wondering what I'll do about getting rid of the evidence. Well, of course, someone like me has a fair few options, but I'll show you the one I enjoy the most. The little dog teased with a wicked grin on its face. I turned and saw that the terror was now right next to me. Slowly the canine's head turned into unnerving floating black liquid that defied gravity, grew in size and floated up. Then from this liquid that light could not penetrate, 5 monstrous grinning wolf-like mouths with jagged teeth appeared on the end of 5 tentacles, and these immediately shot out. The mouth sank into the screaming, crying survivors. As the monster devoured them, another couple of mouths shot out of the body to spit some sort of acid, which completely dissolved the corpses and spilled blood. A nervous grin grew on my face as it dawned on me just how powerful this creature was. My mouth went bone dry, and my head cleared itself of all of the force as I tried to figure out what to do. I could have just wiped their memories, but where would be the fun in that? The little dog chuckled.